Good morning, everybody. Oh, sensitive microphone today. How's everybody doing? You seem to like each other. This is good. Good conversation. It's always good whenever I can say hi by interrupting conversation instead of being, the one voice among the crickets. So it's good that everybody's getting along like this. Welcome back. For the record, I still don't understand why we decided to have the night owl of the group be the one to say hi first. I hate mornings, and so this is really hard for me. Let's see, I wanted to say something. Brain is not in gear yet because I hate mornings. So I'll start with the thing that I'm going to forget if I don't just throw it out there now. For folks with mobility concerns, getting to and from lunch, we have successfully acquired a golf cart. Hooray. I think I might actually even get to drive the golf cart too. This will be fun. If this does not scare you away, you are welcome to request the services of a golf cart to get yourself to and from here and lunch, and we'll go from there. We might be able to reserve the golf cart for other trips as well if necessary, like mornings and such, but we'll talk about that at lunch if needed. See, I think that was the only announcement I needed to make, I believe. All right. There was one other thing I needed to put up there. Today's schedule looks remarkably similar to yesterday's, except, and I have a typo up there. Instead of opening high, it's supposed to say opening keynote. Good job. Don't design slides in the morning because you hate mornings. Okay. But we don't have the keynote in the afternoon, so our day ends a little bit earlier than it did yesterday. But the workshops that you see at the bottom line there might be kind of news to you. But here are today's workshops and the rooms that they are in. So we're going to have a workshop on, well, I guess, using hypothesis. Where's my hypothesis? Do you want to say a word? Using hypothesis. I picked the right two words. That's awesome. So hypothesis annotation software, software service. What's the right word? Service. Pick the right word again. Cool. And then, let's see, domain of one's own. You all know what that is, I imagine. V-Connecting Incubator. V-Connecting, giving folks who are not with us here in person. I don't know what camera I should be waving to for the V-Connecting folks who are watching right now. We'll have a workshop this afternoon, showing how that works. Kind of, sort of like a behind the scenes sort of, here's what we do when we do those, to take part in that process. And then Chris Schaffer is going to be doing the coding for teachers. At least I think he is. I haven't seen him yet, but I'm assuming. All right. And so if you want to get your geek on, we've got workshops for you today. That's kind of where we're headed with this. And I think that's everything I needed to present to everybody, so I'm going to hand the mic over to Sean, or Sean comes with his own mic, so that makes that even easier to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm here to introduce Cathy Davidson, our speaker this morning. I first met Cathy in December of 2012. I met her in person in December of 2012. We'd actually been on the phone and in Google Docs, I think, before that. When we gathered at Stanford, a few of us gathered at Stanford to talk about kind of the future of higher education now that MOOCs were on the landscape. For a few of us, that gathering was really a lot less about MOOCs and more about what had happened to the, well, how do I say this? What had changed in the attention to learning and education because of MOOCs. MOOCs drew our attention to something that was going on in learning that had sort of been frosted over, if you will. And all of a sudden the digital was really important again in higher education. MOOCs themselves were sort of a red herring for a lot of us who were there that day, but the discussion was really important. As rich as the conversations were, though, that day, I really feel like I met Cathy that night over dinner. I knew that she was I'm going to read this because I can't possibly memorize all your... I knew that she was the Ruth F Des Varney Professor Emerita of English at Duke University at the time, and held a second distinguished chair at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies. I also knew that President Obama had nominated her to a 6-year term on the National Council for the Humanities. But the Cathy that I spoke with that night was a whole lot more than her Wikipedia entry. One of the things that impressed me the most about Cathy that night, I was there with my husband, who, while extremely intelligent, has no formal education. He's actually changing that right now. But and we stood and we talked about education and about pedagogy with Cathy, and what I loved about it was that she didn't care who we were, where we came from. She was just invested in talking to us about pedagogy and about learning and what was going on with higher education. And in the process of that conversation, she also talked a lot about her own coming up in the academy as a woman in an environment that is difficult for women to make their way forward, and the kinds of challenges that face a person when they're coming up through the academy that way. We also talked about the eerie success of the Khan Academy, about the pedagogical misdirection of the LMS, about how Silicon Valley really doesn't understand how learning happens. But we were more focused on, in that conversation, around the sort of non-traditional student. And by non-traditional, I don't just mean people who are coming to education and have jobs and have children and they have to come part-time, or they're attending community college or whatever it may be. I'm also talking about people who look at learning differently and who want learning to be something else than what the institution offers. Cathy herself, in a conversation last night, and actually I think that night too, in a conversation last night around the dinner table, we were talking, and she talked about being expelled. Is that correct? Expelled, suspended. Okay, suspended 3 times, expelled once, as she was in middle school, high school. Middle school is different. Okay, middle school, whole nother story in middle school, and sort of the idea that actually it was funny because around the table we found out that a lot of us were troubled students and troubling students, and that somehow we all ended up doing this, which is funny because I guess we're just a bunch of troubled students trying to make trouble everything else. And Cathy is sort of in a lot of ways the conversations that took place there in Stanford, with Cathy, with Audrey, with Bonnie Stewart, were foundational to what Digital Pedagogy Lab has become. When I was talking to Cathy that night, it became clear to me that there was a need for voice. There was a need to give voice to people who did not have it. And I think that's something that I really admire about Cathy's work, is that she's always reaching out and reaching out to students who need advocates, basically, trying to find ways to support people who are otherwise overlooked. And what I discovered in Cathy that night, and I want to read this part because it's really good, but what I discovered about Cathy that night was someone who has a hawk's eye trained on the underrepresented in education. See? Cathy is currently a distinguished professor and director of the Futures Initiative at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. But who I'd really like to introduce is my colleague and friend, Cathy Davidson.
That was super, thank you. Am I mic'd? Can everyone hear me? Okay. So it's so fabulous to be here. I feel like I'm with my people. And I'm very, very grateful to have been able to spend yesterday with everybody and to be able to speak with you today. Yeah, I was a misfit in school. And I've recently moved from Duke University, where I taught many years. I don't have, my undergraduate degree is from Elmhurst College, a tiny little college that I was able to go to because at that time, Illinois paid scholarship money to people to go to any school in state as long as you promised to work in state for 2 years. So I went to a tiny little liberal arts college, the only school that would have accepted me at the time. I was lucky. Gwendolyn Brooks, the famous Gwendolyn Brooks, was my mentor as a first-year student. Kofi Wooner-Williams, Wole Soyinka, and Maria Baraka were people that were in that taught my freshman English class. I mean, how lucky was that? But I believe this generation of students has a burden no other generation has. Not only the soaring tuitions and tuition debt and the abdication of higher education as a public good, but a lot of noise in the system about how college isn't worth it. When everything we know from the research is if you're going to make any investment, invest in college. It's not a safe bet, but it's safer than any other bet people have in this terrible economy for young people and for people trying to be middle class that we have. So a lot of this talk is motivated by that, and it's motivated by the move I've made to I actually am not, I teach at the Graduate Center. I'm employed by City University of New York, and I do projects throughout all 24 of the campuses, all 500,000 students. Do a lot of projects with our community college systems. I recently was given the very flattering title by a high administrator who will be nameless, who said, you know, you're basically our cash cow, which was a funny thing to me. Said, what that means is I help with grants. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of grants throughout all of the CUNY system, and go in and help troubleshoot, help grant, because I was a vice provost for interdisciplinary studies for 8 years at Duke, and my job there was to make programs where none could possibly exist, to make programs across the silos of the university that had never worked together before. And I often did that by having people apply for grants together. In other words, instead of telling them to make a program, I said, hey, here's an opportunity. Let's come together around this opportunity. And it's amazing, and I love that about Tressy's talk yesterday. That's going to be a theme in mine as well. How if you make something a project where people contribute to an opportunity rather than a barrier, somehow barriers fall away. It's a magic that happens. Starting with an assumption that we can do this together rather than the assumption of, oh my God, how are we going to do this together? And I know that sounds Pollyanna-ish, but it's actually worked for me a lot in my career, and that's basically what I do at CUNY now, because it's a system of 24 campuses, loosely federated and often not coordinated in specific ways and then intimately coordinated in others. So often coming up with opportunities rather than obstacles, and seeing it not as bureaucracy, but as a chance to take a challenge together. I find it really works. To start with we got to start with Karl Marx, right? For this, the legislator is alone to blame by having, this is about the Factory Act of 1833, which is what makes the public schools in England. While it would seem to provide the children employed in factories should be educated, it contains no enactment by which that professed end can be secured. It provides nothing more than that the children shall on certain days of the week and for a certain number of hours, 3, in each day be enclosed within the 4 walls of a place called a school, and that the employer of a child shall receive weekly a certificate to that effect signed by a person designated by the subscriber as a schoolmaster or schoolmistress. I don't know that that's different than higher education today. The regulation of time, of place, of who gives the credits. On the other hand, there's bellhooks. Okay. I entered the classroom with the conviction that it was crucial for me and every other student to be an active participant, not a passive consumer. Learning is a place where paradise can be created. Okay. I think in higher education we have both of those models at once, right? We have the model of education as the pathway, the transition, the transformation. And for traditional students, it happens exactly at the most contested point in our life, in our society, that age between 18 and 21. Can you vote at 18? Can you go to war at 18? Can you drive a car? Can you take out a loan? Are you a legal independent? Can you be executed? Right? Those things go back and forth in our society, and it's at that contested time. Are you going to be the next generation? Are you going to be a productive adult? Can you take on the torch from the past generation? Can you move forward? We don't know what age that is. And that's the age, the traditional age that we call college, right? It's epic, right? It's a before and after, a transformation. We happen to call it college. The interesting thing is that transformation happens even, and you all know this, but we have to tell this to the end of college people. It happens for the most untraditional students that one can teach. My first college class, I got my PhD very, very early. Despite my checkered childhood, I ran through higher education. So I handed in my dissertation on the morning, I was determined, the morning of my 23rd birthday, the first draft of my dissertation. And I started, I mean, I was not, anyway. So I taught my first class, full independent class at the college, Elmhurst College, where I'd gotten my undergraduate degree when I was about to be 24. And the youngest student in my class was 32. Okay. I was terrified until I realized they were looking at me for transformation, right? And I worked harder than I've ever worked. I worked harder than they ever worked. And I actually saw each of those students, all of whom were, the oldest student was 62. I went to each of their graduations. Jean, the woman who was 62 in the class, the day they let me give her diploma, she asked for it, and the day after I gave her diploma, she said she was going to retire from her job as a vice president of an insurance company and do what she'd always wanted to do, which was travel the world. She traveled on military transport planes. She wasn't a rich woman. She just found a way to travel the world, and she would send me a postcard from every place with a quote from, I was teaching American literature, from one of our authors. Du Bois in Ghana, Hemingway in Capri, And from Paris, she wrote me a postcard saying that she'd actually had cancer several times, and she'd had recurrences, and she was planning to live as long as she could. And she kept traveling, and then the postcard stopped. And I like to think that she took me as her professor on the journey on which I had taken her as her professor. That's one view of higher education. Then there's the other one. Right? The so-called industrial age, how you school people. And I must admit, I'm not a techno-utopian by any means, but I didn't like the 20th century very much. I just didn't agree. It didn't agree with me. For me, school was this. It was miserable. Every minute of it was miserable. I hated sitting in those desks. I hated paying attention. I hated having to have the right answers. I hated having to fill out those multiple choice tests. And I do believe with Marx that compulsory public education was training for factory life. The secret weapon was us, right? The school marm, the schoolmaster was us in the training and the enforcing of that model of education. Needless to say, there have been people breaking it from the very beginning, and we continue to break it. But as my argument today is, we're breaking it against structures that are hard to break. One of the things I've been doing a lot of research on lately is Charles Eliot's founding of the Research University in the United States. Charles Eliot was independently wealthy from the famous Eliot family that goes all the way back to the Mayflower. And he thought he was going to be, he graduated from Harvard, top of his class. He was going to be a theoretical chemist. And then his father lost everything in the Panic of 1857. And Eliot thought he was going to have to go into business, and instead decided he was going to go into the business of education and remake the Puritan college for the world of today. All over Europe, people were blaming the American college system for the world's first worldwide financial collapse, which was the Panic of 1857. And he went to Europe to study the universities in Germany and France. Interestingly, he interviewed lots of people who didn't go to college about the universities, which I think is pretty fascinating, actually. He was an ethnographer of the universities. Came back, though, and started creating a university. And at one point in his career, and I've been reading this a lot, he actually started corresponding with Frederick Winslow Taylor, the great theorist of scientific labor management. It was the last 10 years of Eliot's life. Taylor wrote to Eliot because he admired what Eliot was doing so much. And then Eliot wrote back to Taylor saying, hey, I like you too. It is only through enforced standardization of methods, enforced adoption of the best implements and working conditions, enforced cooperation that faster work can be assured, and the duty of enforcing the adoptions of standards and enforcing this cooperation rests with management alone. Typical Taylor idea of outputs and inputs. Remember, he was the Zuckerman, the Mark Zuckerberg of his era, who was going to Harvard, dropped out, and went to a pig iron factory and became he was blue blood, totally Philadelphia blue blood family, decided that manufacturing was the order of the day, and revolutionized the idea of standardized labor for the assembly line era. He and Charles Eliot, the creator of the Modern Research University, become friends. I used to say Charles Eliot translated scientific labor management into scientific learning management. I thought I was being very clever. Then I found out that Frederick Winslow Taylor was the first professor of business at the world's first, unless you went to Wharton, then you say second, business school, which is the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. And what was his job at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth? Taking scientific labor principles to apply to higher education. Okay. These are some of the things that did not exist in American higher education before American education before 1860, and that were fully, firmly institutionalized and in place by 1926. Mandatory public secondary schooling, K through 12 curriculum requirements, land-grant universities, research universities, majors, minors, electives, divisions, certification, graduate school, collegiate law school, nursing school, graduate school of education, collegiate business school, degree requirements, credit hours, grade statistics, standard deviation, spreadsheets, blueprints, return on equity, punch clocks, IQ tests, giftedness, learning disabilities, multiple choice tests, college entrance exams, multiple choice entrance exams, the American Association of Universities, tenure, sabbaticals, faculty pensions, school rankings, very important, as we heard yesterday from Tressie, donor named chairs, corporate sponsored research, adolescence, failure, and then we could go on from there. Right? All of these things are being developed at the same time. Right? When people talk about the corporatizing of the university, absolutely. There's nothing about the research university that wasn't corporate. Every university that was built from whole scratch at that time, Stanford, University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins, well, those are the great private research universities, they're all completely corporate sponsored by the so-called robber barons of the era. And so was everything Charles Eliot did. Okay, all of the schools of nursing, the graduate school of education, the professional schools, the medical schools are named schools named after the great robber barons of the late 19th century. Okay, there are two things I hadn't read, and I'm just going to really quickly talk about them because they're hilarious and a little crazy. Grades, first implemented at Mount Holyoke College, and I can't remember the date right now, something like 1886, but it's not in my head, I don't have it. The big argument, if you go back to the files, the archives, I'm basically an archival historian originally, worked on the 18th century, the last information age, the mass machine-made paper, machine-made books. Speaking of which, you all have that technology in your hands. I'm going to be doing some interactive things, and I'm using that great technology, machine-made paper, machine-made pencils or pens. So make sure you have those at the ready, because I'm going to do time testing. Mount Holyoke, you go to the archives, and the thing people most were worried about at Mount Holyoke when they decided to be the modern school for women and go from this archaic way of writing long comments and going to ABC gradings was, if we put an E on someone's paper, someone might think it's excellent instead of a failure. So we can't do that. So they invented the ABCDF grade and the Skip-D. The American meatpackers, within 2 years, pick up grading as a method. I've read the archives of the American Meatpackers Association. The biggest argument about ABCDF grading for the meatpackers was it didn't begin to account for the complexity of sirloin versus beef versus ribs versus rump steak, right? It's a qualitative argument. And in fact, to this day, and I did interviews with modern meatpacking people, to this day, the metadata, we would call it, of every grade travels with every piece of meat. So if you see a graded piece of meat, you can track who gave the grade, what the criterion are, what is their grade range, how they graded, and their written comments about inspecting that meat. That's interesting to me. Meanwhile, ABCDF grading goes like wildfire throughout throughout education in general. That's just interesting to me. And I think part of it is, and that's part of my argument today too, is that we're so worried about the stigma we take as educators that we're impervious to change, that often we lead with change that actually is inimical to our basic mission as people who care about students learning research ideas. Right? I think ABCDF grading is a great metaphor for MOOCs and a lot of other things that are imposed on a system without really looking deeply at what we care about and whether the technologies we're using support or in fact undercut what we do. The other one I had of that long list that I hadn't read was multiple choice grading, invented by Thorndike of the Thorndike dictionaries, and then implemented in a doctoral dissertation at Kansas State University by Frederick J. Kelly in 1914, teachers' marks, their variability and standardization. This is not very much different than an SAT test now. 1914. Draw a line around the word cow. No other answer is right. Even if a line is drawn under the word cow, the exercise is wrong and nothing counts. That's why I was kicked out of school so many times. So I circled, I underlined, I crossed out. Stop at once when time is called. Do not open the papers until told so that all may begin at the same time. How, that's not much different than No Child Left Behind, end of school, mandatory summative testing. Right? Interestingly, Kelly did this because there was a crisis in America. It was a huge crisis of immigration, and 2 years of secondary schooling was no longer optional but compulsory. People couldn't handle it. So he came up with a system that you could grade with a grade sheet, like a little thing with little holes through it, so you didn't have to be a professional to grade it. In fact, he hired what we would call adjunct teachers to do the grading to help students through. He led a very long life and protested standardized testing for most of the rest of his life, as did, of course, I'm not talking about IQ. Anything on that sheet you could have talked about for a day. I mean, there's all of the earlier one of all the things that are invented between 1860 and 1925. IQ tests, of course. Benet's IQ test. He also, on his deathbed, was still protesting that people were saying IQ told you anything about intelligence. It was meant to be a test to help the French school system sort out people who had what we would now call learning disabilities in order to get them more help. And it got terribly misappropriated as this thing that then very quickly got racialized and used in World War I, famously, to racialize who was basically sent into battle to die and who got to be an officer. Okay, first thing on the sheets, this is a 10-second one. What year was this photo taken? Just 10 seconds. Time test. Anyone write down, is everyone finished? You need one more minute. Okay, did anyone write in the 1970s? One person, two. 80s? Few? 90s? Whatever you call 2000? The aughts? Ooh, the aughts, cool. The aughts, the teens? Okay, it's actually 2013. Okay. Now it's fascinating to me that could actually, I had to find a picture with no cell phones in it. That was not easy. But it's fascinating to me that it could be before or after the popularization of the internet, right? We still haven't changed our method very much. And if that was to train you for the factory, I'm wondering how in the world this trains you for a world where, I don't know about you, but I don't live a 9-to-5 life anymore. My whole friggin' life is in my cell phone, right? I go to the beach, and I'm going to turn off everything, and then my phone rings, and it's my dad who's 90, so of course I'm going to pick up. And then I've got the phone, and I also see I've got some messages, and before I know it, I'm working, right? All those 19th century divisions that Marx talks about, labor and leisure, weekends and weekdays, things we fought hard for, worker protections we fought hard for, right? That darn cell phone, it's violated all of those, right? My workplace is here, right? And it's constant. Conversely, I go to my office. It's in the old B. Altman's department store right across from the Empire State Building, 19th century office. I walk down a hallway. I go into my office, and I'm going to shut out the world, right? I'm going to shut the door as if that shuts out my world anymore, right? So even when I'm trying to concentrate at work, it's not work. Labor and leisure don't exist anymore. Because now my 90-year-old dad might be texting me or emailing me, and I'm worried, so I go in, and so suddenly then I'm not doing work either. My life is completely merged. How does that world of standardized testing that we have now insanely enforced, Americans test earlier and more often than any other country on the planet. How does that world of standardized thinking, one best answer from 4 possible or 5 possible choices, possibly prepare you for a world where everything is mixed and merged? right? Where we don't have divisions that we spent a century creating, and an institution that was based on those kinds of partitions. Okay. So the great project in the 19th century was to train farmers how to be factory workers and shopkeepers how to be corporate managers. I want to ask if the great project of the post-industrial age is to make us all into Uber drivers. If you talk to the heads of any of these on-time learning, they say it's because the future of labor is casual labor, is adjunctification, not of the teaching profession. Our students are taking classes from adjunct laborers in order to become adjunct laborers, right? I believe not in the typical post-narrative, we were in the industrial age, now we can do something modern and it's going to be Coursera, edX, and Udacity. But that what Marx was telling you about was not a description, was not praise, but a warning. And we need that for the kind of education we're dealing with now. I don't want to train a generation of Uber drivers. I'm at the end of my career. Right? I want to train people who protest what computation is doing to right ways of organizing labor, ways of organizing life that we fought a whole century for. Right? I want students to know everything about computation, not so they can be Uber drivers, but so that they can fight a world where the ideal being perpetrated by the people who run Coursera and edX, and specifically Udacity, is this free-flowing kind of casual labor where everybody is learning all the time because they're always being superannuated. Right? Everybody learning all the time is great. To do that to feed an exploitative labor market is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. I want engaged, activist, and reflective education, critical thinking, creative thinking, and computational thinking that together is about thinking about the world our technology's made. Technology doesn't matter. No one cares about technology unless it changes your life. I want a generation of students who care about how this technology has changed their lives and know enough about it to fight back, to use it where appropriate, and to fight back where they can. Okay. April 22nd, 1993 is the day I date as the beginning of the internet. That's the day the faculty members and scientists from the National Center of Supercomputing Operations came out in came out into the world and announced that this thing they'd been using for almost 10 years was now available to the public. That's the Mosaic 1.0 browser. When that announcement was made, there were 26 websites in the world. Okay? By the end of 1993, there were 10,000 websites. By one calculation during that same time period, internet use increased 250,000%. History of technology is my original field. There's no other technology in the history of the world that has been adopted that fast, that globally, that extensively. Right? The mantra of the Mosaic 1.0 browser and everyone is that anyone can participate. Anyone can participate. If you have it, and what you can do, if you have an internet connection, any idea you have, without an editor, without a publisher, can be communicated at once, either with your name, without your name, anonymously, to anyone else in the world that has an internet connection. That's an astonishing human superpower. Astonishing, and a kind of crazy responsibility, right? It's out there, right? No pause button. It is out there. But to me, the real question, and the question I want our students to be understanding, is yeah, anyone can participate, but who does? And how much does it cost, both in actual dollars and cents and in human personal terms? How much does it cost? Unless we answer those questions, we're not answering the great questions of technology of our time. We have another issue. Structural inequality. Okay. It hasn't gotten better, right? The internet, anyone can participate. We're all one big family. We can all participate. We can communicate with anyone in the world, right? At the same time that we have the internet happening, we have neoliberalism happening, right? Cutting back medical rights, public funding of higher education, a range of social services being curtailed. Certainly the labor movement has been hugely curtailed, almost coincident with the international, not causal, but coincident. Managerialism and a pressure to make college students shovel ready, right? To teach them the skills so they can go right out into the workforce. A workforce that, according to Google, won't have jobs, any middle-class jobs, of the human-powered middle-class jobs of the kind we now know now, by 2030. 45% of those, Google says, will be gone by 2030. The AlphaGo computer that just beat the world's greatest Go master supposedly is going to put 240 million call workers out of work by the end of this year. Right. This year. I don't know about, I'm old enough to remember when call center workers were like, you know, in little shops in Main Street, right? They were service centers in Main Street. Now they're all decentralized and mostly in India and China, Thailand, and Nova Scotia, and Philippines. They're all going to be out of work. 240 million because of one computer. Right? Okay, these are the issues of our time. Wikipedia. Anybody can contribute, anyone, and I'm a huge fan of Wikipedia. It's amazing. And then you think about the fact that 8% of the editors are female, and that's proportionately what the content is, right? Anyone can participate. Who does? Right? Majority minority. These are this year's college figures on college completion rates. U.S. adults over 25 with college degrees. Asians 53%, whites 36%, blacks 23%, Hispanics 15%, Native Americans 9%. Among the things that just get my goat and bother me is when this came out this year, I think it was in June, the headline read, more whites than blacks have college degrees. They're like, well, why don't we just say whites are kind of roughly average? Why is it more whites than blacks have college degrees instead of, hey, Asians are beating you white people like crazy? You know, I mean, that kind of reporting of the news is in itself racist, as is the news that's being reported. Right? And then, with the new majority of students coming into our classrooms, we still have a full-time, full professorate that's 85% white, 68% male. It's not working. Those structures of selectivity that were put in place by Charles Eliot and his cohort roughly in the last part of the 19th century are partly about repeating hierarchies of the past. He didn't want anyone who had a father that could go to Harvard be able to go to Harvard. He wanted an entrance test that would still be elitist. He also created the national ranking systems for college that, guess what university is on top in the gold standard? Harvard, right? So you rank all of the universities. This is what Tracy talked about yesterday. You rank hierarchies of university by criteria that are based on Harvard. Of course you then get a replication effect. Of course. That's everything we do and everything we credential is based on replication of a hierarchy that's been existing since the late 19th century. I personally believe, and you probably all see me on Twitter say this 1,000 times, you cannot counter structural inequality with goodwill. It does not work, right? Supposedly we're all liberals in higher education, right? We're all progressive and anti-racist. We're 85% white and nearly 70% male. So our verbiage doesn't work. Our theories don't work. You need something structural to counter structural inequality. Lonnie Guinier famously calls our method of testing and entrance exams for testing the tyranny of meritocracy. Because the people who are doing well are working really hard. My Duke students worked really, really insanely hard to get into Duke. Right? There's still a replication effect. Right? But you feel, that's her point in The Tyranny of Meritocracy, a great book if you haven't read it. You feel as if you have earned what you've done, and you don't see that some people don't even have a chance to work like dogs. I believe we have to design new structures that put equality at the core. And with many other educators, I'm working on all of those things in that list. But today I want to talk about things that people can do right now, tomorrow, in classes, in meetings, to try to structure equality. Because I think it can be really depressing if you say the past sucked and the present does too, and so therefore the future is going to be just as bad. I'm actually a very optimistic person. I'm in that Gramscian way that you need optimism to make social change, to make any kind of institutional change. So I like to heed this wonderful exercise. Did all of you read about this? Read this in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Writing teacher at UIUC, University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, where the internet was announced and where the Mosaic 1.0 browser was given to the public, had her students read all the editorials that were being written about millennials today and also about lectures and how it's important to have those students in the lecture hall and lecture at them. Right? They need that. They need that discipline. And her students collectively wrote a letter back. It's a very eloquent letter to the Chronicle of Higher Education. I highly recommend that you read it if you haven't yet. This is one little excerpt. Instead of debating the lecture, instead of imagining what students are thinking, get to know us. Wow, how revolutionary is that? Find out what college is like for us now, rather than what it was like for you years ago. Condemning or celebrating the lecture isn't as useful as understanding what we need. So please ask us. The rest of my talk is going to be ways to ask. It's all going to be about ways to ask. The techniques I talk about, not a single one did I invent. I steal them whenever I find them. I'm going to leave this meeting having stolen some new ones. I really liked, Amy, what you did with the carousel. I love the exercise we did yesterday, as depressing as it was, is trying to define a world without a better internet and how to protect ourselves for privacy and security in the future. We couldn't come up with a thing except burn it down and start over, and that's not going to happen. But they were great exercises. All of these are stolen exercises about engagement. I typically do, when I meet with people, either in small groups or large groups, students, faculty, workers. I do lots of work with community activists. I use the technology that was given to you, and we'll do a couple more exercises with it, which is machine-made paper and machine-made pencils or pens, for two reasons. One, often I'm in situations where there's no bandwidth. Right? Two, it's important to make people realize that the key point, the thing we have to fight for in the internet, is that idea of participation, not the idea of technology and tools, but how we can use those to really get what the American Psychological Association calls total participation. Of course, they capitalize the T and the P. Total participation. All that means is you don't count on a lecture, which is one-to-many transmission, nor do you do you rely on a seminar and discussion, which actually, with some of the recent work we've been doing, shows that is more replicative of hierarchy, not less, more than the lecture. In fact, if you sit there with a clicker, as social scientists do, and find out who talks in a seminar, it's the person whose background is most like the professor's background. So if you've got 87% white and almost 70% male, those are the people who are going to talk in the class. It's different if I were my friend Denise Cruz, who teaches at Toronto and who's from the Philippines, teaches a class of 800 students, and she says, when I lecture, it's not the same thing, and she's 100% right. And she has different challenges. And when I talk with women, especially women of color, but all scholars of color, I do a different version of this for not only participation, but how you can be authoritative in a world that denies your authority. It's a different set of issues, it's actually the same, it's a mirror image of the same set of issues. It's the inverse image of the same set of issues. So all of these are about how you, in any setting, whether you're talking to faculty about how to implement technology, whether you're a teacher and talking to students, works with your kids, works in any kind of social activism, these are all ways of trying to structure equality for participation in a group setting. They're really simple, and index cards are all you need. One, and this is a question. So this I'm going to have you write 3 things, 90 seconds today, 90 seconds for this one. What are your 3 best tactics for encouraging total participation? And I don't care if your realm is classrooms, faculty and staff meetings, workshops, planning sessions, retreats. What are the 3 things you do And you're a K through 12 teacher, so you got these down cold. Almost all of these are stolen from either medical school or K through 12, or both. Medical school's stolen a lot from K through 12. So 90 seconds, write down your 3 best tactics for getting everybody to participate. Everybody to have a voice in your class. And this is a 3-part exercise. How many people here have done Thinkpair Share before? Oh, good. I like to do it in a very ritualized way, where turn next to somebody that's next to you and take turns where one person reads their 3 things and the other person listens without interrupting. And the second person says their 3 things and listens without interrupting. And then come up with one thing that you can share with the group. So either you can combine, you can fight, or if you have one that you agree on, just start going. But again, 90 seconds. So talk to the person next to you. Read each of your things aloud. Okay, that's 90 seconds. Excuse me, please. Excuse me. Excuse me. 90 seconds. So I could quit right now. I mean, isn't it, it's amazing how much difference. Postures change, everything changes. And no matter how stupid my talk is, you've all left with something valuable, right? I've done this in the Philadelphia 76ers auditorium with 6,000 IB teachers from around the world. That's so weird to see yourself on those jumbotrons. And they had lasers and all. Like, here she is! That was really something. But 6,000 people were exchanging ideas. You all will get to know each other, and there have been many activities to meet each other. In a normal situation where people were just coming to a lecture and leaving, I would have you write your email down if you felt comfortable doing that and exchanging the cards, so that whatever dark moment you had in your life where you thought there's no way progressive education is going to work, you had somebody you could email who knew 3 things to do. Even if you felt you'd never had an idea in your life, and somebody who could remind you that in that setting, with 90 seconds, you came up with 3 good things. Right? Because thinking about our own resources is hard, especially when we're in despair. There's nothing I can do. This is the easiest thing in the world to do, right? And I really value the ritual of having one person be quiet and one person speak, and then exchanging that. I work with a number of students now, especially when I'm going around the colleges. the CUNY colleges who have either language differences. One of the colleges I work with is LaGuardia Community College, where there are this year 124 separate first languages spoken. If you're teaching English as a second language at LaGuardia to 40 students, you well may have 40 different languages. And they've come up with a brilliant way of teaching. I'm going to just say this. This is so cool. I love this. One of the ways they teach in language ESL classes is have each student do research on the semantic and semiotic and linguistic structure of their language and present that to the class in English. So then when students are, and of course they're learning English as they're doing it, but they're also saying, my language, Mandarin, has no tenses. How weird that English has tenses. So you're going immediately from the deficit model to a contribution model. And everybody's learning that language is this malleable thing. Where, I mean, the Chinese have done pretty well without tenses, right? How can you communicate ideas without tenses? Think about the depth of knowledge you have as you go into language learning when you're coming from that model versus a, how dare you speak with an accent? You all know the joke everybody else in the world tells. What do you call it when you have when you know three languages? You're trilingual. What about two languages? Bilingual. One language, American, right? But we take this as a badge of honor, right? I don't know about you. I come from 3 different ethnic backgrounds. I heard 3 languages growing up. I don't speak a one of them. It's humiliating, right? So this is a model where you take the inventory. Oh, that's coming next. Take the inventory of a class not as deficits, but as contributions to a learning we can all do together so that we don't all have to be Uber drivers and we know how to organize with one another and take advantage of one another's strengths rather than think of one another as having deficits. The ranking, hierarchical, what I am going to call the industrial age model is all about ranking from Harvard to learning disabilities, to the kid who gets kicked out of class every minute because they're dyslexic. But know that they're still pretty darn smart. What I like about this version of Thinkpair Share is exactly that you have some time to put writing down. The shy student, the introvert, hates speaking out, but somehow if it's on the card and they can read it, it's not a problem. I don't quite understand that psychology, but I've seen it tens of thousands of times now. Right? So the shy person gets to have a voice in a class. They never have a voice. There's nothing more demoralizing to me as a teacher and it doesn't happen to me anymore because I evolved these different methods, but I know it happens to many people where you say, wow, I read their final paper and this person who I thought was stupid, they never said anything, suddenly had so much to contribute. Look at all this. That's a waste. Not only a waste of them, but a waste of you. Okay? The listening, the hearing your own voice, synthesizing, reflection, and then sharing with the world beyond. So that's either changing, putting things in a Google Doc. I often have my students put their shared things. We're not going to have time to do that, but what they share together, put it in find some way to communicate that to the world. Make it a resource for other people. 2, I don't call it a manifesto. That's a private joke. But I do have every class now write a class constitution. This is one from a class I taught some years ago where the students I also have students write their syllabus, and I also have them come up with a grading system. I'm not going to talk about those as much today. But a class constitution also works for every committee I ever chair. I don't go in with an agenda. The first assignment of the committee is to have the group come up with an agenda. It solves incredible problems. So if you're coming in as the technologist into a group to teach them technology, first thing you could do is have the group write about what they want to learn today. Give them 20 minutes to talk, or 15 minutes to talk about it, and come up with a document where they say, these are the 5 things we want to learn today. It will make your job so much easier, I promise you. I promise you. It changes everybody's relationship to the project. Right? They're invested in it. They're invested in your success instead of feeling like they're stupid and you're talking down to them, which is, like a killer for learning, a killer for motivation. Right? My constitutions have been used so many times by so many people. I never start with a blank page. I always start with somebody else's constitution that my students modify, because a blank page can be too intimidating. Right? This is like 12th generation now. A professor at Berkeley who was teaching community activism in, I'm going to say Nicaragua, but I'm not sure if that's right, did a bilingual one, and then we did this one back for the class we were doing. This class decided as their final paper. I've now had 2 classes do this. They didn't want to write term papers. They wanted to write a book on how to do student-centered peer learning. 3, inventory superpowers and kryptonite. first day of class, I like to use a card, and we're not going to do it today, but you could, where everyone writes, for this project we have together, we're in this class together 12 weeks. What 3 things do you have to contribute that I might not know you can contribute? And I like to give examples. Maybe you can do comics. Maybe you're a photographer. Maybe you can do video editing. What 3 things might I never and no one else ever learn about? Maybe you're trilingual. What things might you be able to contribute that could really help us with our project? Then I have them turn over the card and write 3 areas where you'd love some help. And then after we've talked about that a while, I have people go to the board, and I use giant Post-its a lot, have giant Post-its where I have people write the thing they most would like help on, and then take small Post-it notes and put their name over it saying, I can help you on that. So on the first day of class, everyone's made a syllabus, created a class constitution. Grading usually comes later when they figure out how they're going to be assessed, not graded, but assessed. And had something they really want to learn where somebody else has pledged to help them. It's an amazing way to start a class, amazing way to start. It changes everything in the class. This is something I actually don't do because I always kind of giggle, but it's an amazingly powerful idea that Samuel Delany, the science fiction writer who's at Temple, came up with. He was in his 40s when he taught his first class. He was already famous as a science fiction writer. He himself is black and gay, has no college, no high school. I think he may have gotten a high school degree, but he has no degree beyond that. He was so excited about talking to college students. They were like his fantasy. Wow, college students, they know everything. These are the kids who have what I didn't have. They have the chance I didn't have. And he asked a question, and there were 3 black kids in the back of the room who did this and avoided eye contact. He's like, wait, I'm black. What's going on here? And other students were looking askance. And he couldn't believe that was happening in college. He couldn't believe it. Every time you don't answer a question, you're learning how to make do with what you've got. You're learning how not to ask for a raise. You're learning how to take it. That's not good. That's not good. So from now on, whenever I ask a question, everybody's got to put up their hand. I don't care whether you know or not. You need to teach people they're important enough to say what they say. So what he does, he literally, every class, he asks questions, everyone has to raise their hand. And then he calls on anyone he wants. And you can either say, I don't know the answer. But I think my friend Amanda does. And then Amanda can answer or say, oh, I don't know the answer either. And if it gets too much, then they talk about why no one knows the answer. Or you say, I don't understand the question. That becomes a conversation. Or you say, I do know, and that becomes a conversation. The thing you can't do is feel shame for not knowing because you're supposed to not know when you go to college. Right? There's something fundamentally corrupt if students feel shame about not knowing. Right? Fundamentally corrupt about students and feeling they don't know something in a class. If they don't know, there has to be a follow-up question. Why don't you know? You didn't do the work? Why didn't you do the work? Are you bored? Are there stress situations that prevent you from doing the work? What he finds is as soon as everybody, and we now have a lot of cognitive stuff about the gesture even of raising your hand changes your presence in the room. Students all read the work now. The quality of the work in his classes has gone up hugely because they know he's going to do this. That's simple. These are simple things. These are things you can do tomorrow. Right? I'm trying to make these be optimistic, simple things you can do tomorrow. It's a toolkit for how to change a situation tomorrow. Exit pass. I don't think, what did we decide, Jesse? I can't remember. Are people going to do it? Are you going to collect an exit pass or just, you're going to ask it on the end? Normally in a situation where I'm staying around and doing a workshop with people afterwards, I have them do the same thing I do with every single class every day. My students end by asking a question. I didn't understand this. I can't get this out of my head. This is really interesting. I want to talk about this some more. And then I make that the basis of the beginning of the next class. Right? In a workshop like this, I would do that and then make that the basis of a workshop. Okay. Just what's bugging you? What did we talk about today that was really interesting? And what's bugging you? Again, super easy. A friend of mine who teaches at McGill University has 600 students in his class. He uses the exit class every day and has people sign it. It takes roll. It's the equivalent of a pop quiz. And it helps him do a temperature read in the class. And his students read more and engage more because They know that they're being heard. He turns the crappiest lecture situation into an interactive with this simple technique, almost free, right? No clickers, no, right? And this is technology. If we believe the internet's use is as an interactive technology, everything we're doing here is technology. It's making you think like technology, not use it on top of old-fashioned thinking. That's a huge difference, huge difference. Value what you count. I don't think I have time today to go into different systems. I'm really skeptical about the commercializing of badging. On the other hand, I think that I actually have my students do badging in all kinds of project work where they invent the badges, invent the criteria, talk about what they're learning in the class. It's an amazing way of students being reflective about what it means to be in a collective situation with other people trying to learn together. So it isn't about getting the grade, but maybe cooperation, maybe about reflection, maybe about exchanging, maybe about skills share, maybe about learning project management, maybe about, there's so many things, but I don't have to tell them. They come up with that. The most powerful example I ever had, this is really powerful, was I taught a class with Dan Ariely, the behavior economist, who had never taught this way. And to his credit, he's an amazing human being. He said, well, I always lecture, but let's try it. So we did this class where we divided everybody into a group. And we actually came up with topics. They came up with the readings for each topic in the group, and they were responsible for that day's topics and lectures. They would interview us, and then they turned our class into an online, what did they call it? A SPOC.
Small private online course.
Something like that. Except it was maybe it was something public online, but because they made it public. And they designed a beautiful course that included our lectures, because we knew that would get people involved. Dan Ariely is a best-selling author many times over. We get people to read it, and it used the topics, but they made the content. And they worked in project teams, and I had a whole bunch of apprentice teachers. I usually have apprentice teachers working with me, who then would meet with each project team each week to see how the bigger project of turning our class into a public class was going. And in one of the projects, we had a badging system where each week you would have the 12 or 15 criteria that the team had come up with as being important to contribute to the week's projects. And you were only allowed to you never grade negatively in a badge. You only give somebody a badge if they earn it. And so each person had a badge in each of these 12 things that they could award to any of the 4 people in the group. And they all did that independently. And then with somebody there, because it can be shocking, with somebody there who can help, we put it together and see who's contributing what to the group. And then we talk about that as a model of projects. And in one of my groups I had, and I'm going to try to disguise this a little, somebody who was the most important actor on campus, who was movie star handsome, who in fact has I don't know if it's a brother or a cousin who's a movie star who, if I said his name, most of you would recognize it, and who was captain of one of the sports teams at Duke. So big man on campus. He got no badge. No badge. And he came up to me afterwards and said, that lecture, that unit we did last time, where we talked about how gorgeous, talented people actually don't get much feedback. He's like, that's been my whole life. It's the first time I've ever realized I'm a loser. He said, let me handle this. He walked back to the group. He said to the group, I have failed you. Not going to fail you again, but I'm below 0 now, so you have to come up with something that none of you wants to do that I can do for the next class so I can get back to 0 and contribute. And I am sorry. I mean, needless to say, he's got a great recommendation from me. But what an amazing experience. I would not do that without having somebody there in a different role, because that would be too hard to handle if they were all there. But it was a very, very powerful experience. I think you could ask any of the 4 people in that group, including that student, and they would all say, for all of them, it was a life-changing experience, including to the other 3 who quickly said, we were afraid to tell you that you were a loser. Peer pressure is so powerful. That's why this seminar replicates hierarchy. Right? Many systems. I've been working for the last 6 years on many different possible systems as alternatives to grading, which I think grading is just so stupid. Right? Another quick story is Alexander Coward at Berkeley. teaches Math 1A, which is the flunk-out course. Only 10% of students in Math 1A. Berkeley is always in the top 3 of math departments in the world, the only public school in the top 3. They only give a certain percentage of A's on the standardized exam. 20% of his students got A's. Not 10, 20%. He never gave a quiz. He didn't use a textbook. He taught them to think like mathematicians. And then they had to take the exam to pass. 20% instead of 10% got an A in the class. The department chair said, you can't do that. We'll lose our rankings. You can't give 20% A's on this exam. This is you can only give 10% A's. It's a bell curve. He said, I don't care. They all got A's. They passed. They killed your curve. They said, no. We have to be selective or we won't keep our ranking as a top 3 math department. He said, well, you could make the test harder. But they couldn't because then all the other teachers' students would fail. Right? So he was warned that he couldn't do that again. So he walked into his class and said, they don't want me to give 20% next time, so I can't do that again. What do you think we should do? His students got 40% of the students got an A on the math examination. Project learning, 400 students in his lecture class. It's the only math class that closes out. Students enroll in other people's classes and sit in his class. It's project. How did you understand, how did you deal with that algebra question last night or the calculus question or whatever they're working on in that class? And his students talk about the methods and then they get in groups and they work on it and then he gives them another problem to solve. Never grades, just conversation, just talk, just project working through each other. No technology, no technology. He was fired. He's suing the university right now as a whistleblower. He was an instructor, so they could fire him, but because of the comments they made about him breaking the curve and rankings, he's suing them on the grounds that he was a whistleblower. Right. Now, all the for-profits want to hire Alexander Coward because they want to show that higher education is broken. And as he said, there's none of his friends that are teaching in academia now. They all go to Silicon Valley immediately and make so much more money than he does. Right. It's a very, very sad story about how we grade and what grading is in our institution. 7, I think every kind of knowledge should be a public contribution, however you define that, whether it's a blog or something more emphatic. My first year at the Graduate Center, I got to teach with the former president of the Graduate Center, who'd also been the acting chancellor of the whole system. We took applications for the class and accepted 12 students. As you can see, it was everything from computer science to classics. And each of the graduate students, as is true of all CUNY students, if I were hiring now, I would hire graduate students from CUNY. It's unbelievable. They're doing specialized work with Nobel Prize winners and the most famous professors in the field in their research. And then every student teaches 2 classes a year independently at the CUNY campuses, working with some of the most disadvantaged, 70% first-generation college, 70% first-generation American, about 60% living below the poverty line, the most challenging students ever in totally autonomous courses, taking subways 2 hours out to teach at some place where nobody's telling them what to do. Are on their own already while they're doing the graduate work. It's unbelievable to me. We took 12 of those students and we made a tool where all the 365 students they were teaching could give us feedback on our techniques. Each week, a graduate student would come up with they were working in teams, another team would come up with a technique we would use. We would try it out, and then they'd go back and say, how does it work in classics? How does this technique, the kinds of things we're doing in this session, how does it work for teaching research methods at Brooklyn College? Or the same person was also teaching a computer science class, databases at criminal justice at John Jay. And these 365 undergraduates were giving feedback to somebody who'd been formerly the chancellor of the whole system on pedagogy. It was incredible. Right? They wander into some class taught by a graduate student and suddenly they're giving feedback to the chancellor. Right? That's an amazing empowerment. Final project was each class had to come up with some way that what they were learning right then could contribute to the society that was helping them to get an education. My favorite was the art history professor at Brooklyn, I think, Brooklyn College, had her students find all the free art available in Brooklyn at that moment. And they made handbills. They did electronic ones and physical handbills that they put out in the Korean food trucks in Korean, because there was someone in the class who had that skill. We found that out in the skills inventory. They did one other one in Mandarin. They put that in the Chinese food store. They did some in Spanish at the bodegas. And then they got extra credit if they could bring to the museum or to an art exhibit 5 people who had never been to a museum before. The Brooklyn Museum let us bring our students for free because they were so excited by this experiment. And almost everyone went to a Kehinde Wiley, the great portrait painter, African-American portrait painter who does these things, they look like Napoleon, except they're of street people. Beautiful paintings. And people were bringing their grannies these photos. Because so many of the students were illegal alien is the horrible word for it. What's the right word for? Non-documented, thank you. We didn't post any of the photos, but we had people take pictures of their granny. I mean, who wouldn't want their grandchild, who's a college student, to take you to an art exhibit? It was the most amazing experiment. And the students felt like what I'm learning now is actually helping my family, it's helping my community. I'm contributing in this art history class I'm taking for a general ed credit taught by a grad student. This is the most valuable thing I can be doing. It's incredible. 8, I used to start with a mission statement. Now on the last day of class I have everybody, sometimes we read them together, sometimes in twos, sometimes Thinkpair Share. Everyone end with a mission statement about how they're going to take what they're doing in class to change the world out of class. It's also a great thing if you're technologists who are working in technology groups where people have come up with their 4 things they want to do, have them end at the end have them tell you in a mission statement what they're going to do with what they learned that day. It's an amazing tactic. It's as good a tactic as the exit ticket. Right? Here's how I'm going to learn what I learned today. Here's how I'm going to apply that to something in my life, in my teaching, in my job, in my world that's going to change that, to make it a better place. Okay? And I like my students to aim high, maybe that high. This, of course, is Bree Newsom, who is a student at NYU. I interviewed her recently. She had never climbed before. I don't think that was prominent in the media. She had never climbed before. Right? She thought she was going to be arrested and maybe killed. Right? She went up with a friend of hers who stood at the bottom of the pole. And what was amazing is the police came and were hostile at first. And her friend said, well, she's going to go all the way up, and she's never climbed before, so we might as well make ourselves comfortable. Her friend, by the way, is the son of one of the Moral Monday people who meets every Monday in North Carolina protesting the really awful things that have happened in my beloved state of North Carolina. And the police kind of admired it and just sat there and watched her climb up the pole and take down the Confederate flag. Pretty amazing. I think she's a good model, and I think there's lots of things we can aspire to. I think redoing industrial education is not putting more tools for a post-industrial world, but helping to arm our students with the tools we have to understand those tools. Humans make the computers that should be serving humans. If humans are making computers that are hurting us as humans, we need to know how to fight back. Right? Google servers, Apple servers, Amazon servers are in Ireland, so they don't have to pay taxes. Right? That's wrong. Right? They're collecting our data, well, definitely, as we sit here. Right? And they're selling that, they're marketing it back to us and of more vulnerable people than we are in this room. And they're not supporting our society. We have to arm our students to be responsible, knowledgeable agents. Critical thinking? Yes. Also creative thinking. We can't forget the arts. The arts inspire us. They always have. Kehinde Wiley or whoever, they always inspire us to aim higher than we would. And I think computational thinking, to know how the system works, because if you don't know how the system works, you're prey to it. You don't have to know how to code. I think that's stupid to think everyone needs to know. I know how to code. That doesn't help me. I need to know what code does, what it enables and what it disables, and how it changes our life. That, to me, is the code we all have to make and the code we all have to break. I'm very grateful you gave me this time to talk here. I think we have a few minutes for questions, and I would be delighted to take questions. I also hope you remember the real resource in the room is the person you shared with. Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, we do have a few more minutes for questions. If anyone has questions, we can pass the mic around.
I was quite amazed that you picked the introduction of Mosaic rather than going back to the DARPANET.
I could have. I could have done
Well,
that.
I think the DARPANET is much more ominous than people realize, and there were some people in humanities, Walter and Sally Sedlow, who did a great deal of work with it, and I was at conferences with them, but I think the story of the DARPANET needs to come out.
Totally, totally. And in other versions, I do that, where I talk about the militarization. I wanted this one to talk about the possibilities, because I don't think, how can I say this? I was at some pretty downer events yesterday, and I think it's important to also realize that there are potentials, and we can, I knew Audre Lorde. I was very fortunate to know her near the end of her life, and her famous quote is, "You can't use the master's tools and dismantle the master's house." In fact, there was never a slave rebellion where you didn't use the master's tools. You know, I mean, you have to use the master's tools. You just don't have to use them the way the master wants you to use it. Right. And so that was my message today. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. But that's totally right. The internet is absolutely about military uses. The DARPANET was entirely a military operation. Right. I don't think that's, the Mosaic 1.0 browser didn't have the security that could possibly have been militarized in the same way. It had some military uses, but it was mostly used by mathematicians who would take this thing out, set it up, yeah. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
I can shout.
Let's do it for the live stream.
Yeah, there's people streaming, so.
I wanted to go back to that moment with your pretty boy athlete. And I want to recognize the compassion that everyone had for him and the fact that this probably was a deeply transformative moment in the way that you told that story. But I was disturbed by the language where he went back to the group and said, "You have to come up with something for me." So part of
what
me,
can I say? Yeah.
Part of me wondered, in a sense, if he knew how to negotiate his privilege and what the composition of that group was, and if they felt obligated beyond a way that they perhaps should have to dig him out. But I really do want to acknowledge the fact that
Right.
in the context did seem to be a transformative moment. But part of me was kind of hearing that as privilege.
I'm not going to say much more because I don't want to in any way, this is public, so I don't want to in any way jeopardize his privacy or the group's. What I like about that is I taught much of my career at a very privileged university. And even within that situation, there were stratifications and hierarchies. And that could have been replicated anywhere. His way of dealing with the group was his way of dealing with the group. I didn't intrude with that. That was his responsibility and his way of doing it. Has he dedicated his life to social good since then? I have no idea. No idea. It was a very powerful moment. It was a very powerful moment for everyone in that group to realize something about themselves and the way they could be intimidated in the world. And it was a very important way for him. How much that's persisted in terms of his actions, I really can't say more without jeopardizing privacy. But yes, I agree. Yeah, there are other ways of doing it.
Thanks. Thank you first. That was excellent. I'm asking this, and I'm not pandering really, but you seem to have a lot of experience and be very knowledgeable of maintaining an open classroom. And your story about the author, the gay black author that went into the class for the first time and wasn't really able to reach students that he thought he should be able to relate to, gets to a question that I think is should be opened up, is maintaining an open classroom where students are comfortable. Jesse actually sent out a tweet a bit ago, which was really poignant and great. I can't remember the text exactly. But so in your experience, what have you done to get students to relate and really open up and create this open space that we all strive for?
It doesn't happen by accident. I do everything you saw there, that's like about a quarter of the tactics I use in classes.
Right.
And I have students come up with ways too. So I actually structure situations where everyone participates. And very quickly, if it's a small class, you learn very quickly what kinds of accommodations are important to people. The class I taught this last semester was the most insanely diverse class I've ever taught. One of my students is a night manager, one of 2 night managers at Penn Station. I'm a New Yorker. I'm terrified to go into Penn Station. You know, Penn Station was the beautiful station that was torn down in order to make because people weren't using trains, and then they made Madison Square Garden next to it. So it's all subterranean. It's completely chaotic. I asked her one time, my God, you're the night manager? She has about 100 people that report to her. I said, you know, have you ever seen anyone die? She kind of gave me a look like, you dope. Of course, you see people die every night. I mean, it's a rough place. And then other people who were like the classic research-oriented graduate student, all in the same class. Different levels of fluency in English. I had a student who, I'm aware that this is being broadcast, so I won't say any more, but a range of students with issues. And we figured out ways to work together. And in that class, as insanely diverse as it is, they are the ones that voted for a final exam to write a book. And it's up on the internet. It's called Structuring Equality. And it's about the different things we did in the classroom, including an incredible essay. The book opens with an incredible essay about that English language learning exercise that one of the graduate students is developing at Borough, actually not LaGuardia, at Borough of Manhattan Community College. In a huge lecture class, you clearly, if you're like my friend at McGill who teaches 600 students, then maybe the exit ticket is the best you can do. Or Thinkpair Share in a classroom. It's better than nothing. In other words, the reason the subtitle of this is Thinking Big Inside the Box is we all have so many limitations. And what I was trying to do is come up with really simple things that you can do to push against those limitations. So I really do believe change happens incrementally, and change happens when you've had a success at change. So the first time you try something and you realize people aren't just looking at you blankly, but actually are engaged, like when you have them write a mission statement at the end for how they're going to use what you're doing, or them write a constitution where they say these are the 4 things we want to learn today, it changes the attitude in the class. I think if you as the instructor or teacher see that change, you realize something's different and they do too, and that allows you the confidence to build on that and to try something else. We're much better in academia at being negative and critical. We're trained. That's part of what hierarchy is. We're trained to know where we are in the hierarchy, where we are on the bell curve, what our deficiencies are. So things that reward you for success allow you to be more successful. I mean, I know that sounds Pollyannish, but I totally believe it, and certainly see it every day in the kind of life I'm leading now.
Thanks.
We have time for one more short question. Okay.
Hi, Cathy.
Hi, Amanda. I got to see her Amanda get her PhD, what, a month ago, 2 months ago?
April, yeah,
April,
a few months
that's
ago.
unbelievable.
So, like many of you, I'm assuming, I am plagued by grading. And this year, my writing program is adopting a common rubric for accreditation standards. So I am actually shackled by grading. And I'm wondering, especially thinking about the history of grading that you just brilliantly presented us, how we can fight back against those kinds of standards and requirements.
So let me ask a follow-up question. Is the rubric stupid? That was a very thoughtfully worded question. Is it stupid?
We are being recorded.
I know. I will rescind my question, and I will say, if one is faced with excellent rubrics, then in a class you can present those to the students and say, this is the rubrics with how can we make them even better? And the final grade, because this is the box we live in, will be based on these rubrics. But actually, among all of us, we've got these other rubrics which are more powerful than a final grade. Because if you're just learning for the final grade, they've got you. If you're just learning for the final grade, you're lost. If you're just learning for the final grade, you're an Uber driver. Right? So we're going to have something that teaches you all those things that aren't in the rubric that are going to help you not for the grade, but for the mission that you're going to accomplish outside this university and outside this class and outside this moment. I also wouldn't give grades on individual things leading up to the final thing. This is the other thing. Alexander Coward is the very rare mathematician who has a master's degree in education as well, and taught in K through 12 education, and taught in Vietnam in very, very impoverished rural schools, and loves the work of Ruth. Help me out. Oh dear, I've been up since 5. My El Capitan ate my PowerPoint, so I was building the PowerPoint this morning. Famous educator of the late 80s and 90s, whose first name is Ruth, and her last name is a common name, and I'm not going to get it, but I can put it on Slack. Did many, many studies of 3 kinds of grading. Group 1, only formative feedback. And we've got so much research on formative feedback. Comments, feedback, no grade, help it. Group 2 only got summative feedback. Group 3 got what everyone thought was going to be the winner. Formative and summative feedback. You got the written comments and you got a grade. Did the worst. As Alexander says, we're not dogs. A dog, you say roll over, and it rolls over, and you give it a treat, and then you hug it, and he's happy, right? He doesn't say, it's recorded. Doesn't say, you know, that's, how, you know, you gave me a treat because I did your stupid trick? How dare you give me a treat for rolling over? You know, affection, reward, approval, it's all together. It's the opposite for humans. The people who did the summative tests did 30% better on the next test. Right? They actually were learning. And the test is a pretty good one. It's a test, it's not a multiple choice test, it's a thinking test. People who did summative feedback, the good students did better on the next test. The bad students did worse, which we have much research about that too. Low grades make you think I'm a failure. That's Carol Dweck's work, which I think is really interesting, the mindset work. I'm a failure, therefore I can't learn, right? It shames people. The people who got, but the people who did well on the first test and then better on the second test for summative had no gain 6 months out. So it was short-term gains for the smart students, negative gains for the students who did badly on the first test. The students who did the summative and the formative had no gain whatsoever from the formative feedback. They matched the summative feedback. Some of them even had lower scores than the summative. It was like, I've spent my whole life getting grades. Screw this, I don't want it. You know, it's hard to know even what that was about, and that's been measured as well too, and replicated as well. So I mean, it's powerful to think about that, because much of what we do when we're trying to be good, and that's what she thought it would be, was proving it's summative and formative feedback together. Right? So what Alexander Coward does with his math class, they take the grade at the end. Until then, it's just about the learning. So I would make the rubrics a teachable moment, you know. Yeah. And empower your students for all the things they're going to learn that couldn't possibly be on those wonderful rubrics I'm sure were proposed thoughtfully. But there are even more things that will carry them in the world beyond. That's thinking inside the box. That's thinking big inside the box. We all have boxes, right? I don't know anyone who's able to just do what they want to do, right? So trying to push those boxes and be as creative as possible within them is life, but it's also a way to be a happy person. Because I think the people who can't think within the box, it's easy to think outside the box. That's the easiest thing in the world, duh, right? Thinking within the box and finding a happy space within the box is really, I think that's an art. And a lot of actually these techniques are about helping your students learn ways that in their lives, not just in classes, but in their lives, they can think expansively within the box and feel like it's not crushing them. But actually, there is room in there. Wow, there's more room in here than I thought, right? I'm a New Yorker now, so I keep having that dream of opening a closet and finding out I have a second bedroom. I do have a study. Wow, I didn't know my desk was in the living room. I don't need it. I can move it into my study. That's a dream, right? That's a dream, right? But learning that you can have the desk in your living room, it's a nice desk, right? That's a key to success, I think. Maybe I put the bar too low, but for me, that's a great key to success. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Cathy.
Oh,
Okay. One final slide.
I gotta do that.
We're going to adjourn from here back into your tracks. We'll have a short session this morning in your cohort starting at 10:45, and then there will be lunch as usual with a golf cart available for folks who need the golf cart. So thank you so much for coming this morning, and we'll see you soon.